Oh my god, I am surrounded by idiots.
Hey all, Dave here. It's that time of year again, where leaves fall off trees, the mornings are that little bit colder, it starts to get dark much earlier, and people argue that rocks are atheist? Yeah. This is not a video I ever thought I would make, and it's not a video that any atheist should ever have to make. Yet, here we are, with me making a video discussing the question of whether or not rocks are atheist. It's not really an argument that we as atheists should be having, and nor is this the type of argument that should be dividing atheists. As an argument, it says nothing substantial about atheists, atheism, or even rocks. Okay, that's not entirely correct. There are some substantial things that it does say about atheists, but it's not what many of those making the argument thinks it does. So I guess the best place to start here is to do my best to give the strongest reading possible to Aron Ra's argument. So what is Aron's argument? Understanding Aron's argument is important, and it's an easy one to actually misunderstand because of the sloppy wording that he uses. This sloppy wording allows for easy equivocation to happen, so I will do my best here to represent it as fairly and as accurately as possible. And I'll use tweets to show why I am making the deductions that I'm making, and to allow you to see if I am representing it correctly, and for you to also make your own judgments about it. So, what we can see on screen at the moment is the post that started off the recent round of discussion on the topics of rocks and whether or not they are atheist. To which Aron responded with the tweet that you can see on screen at the moment. Now, as you know, I would normally blank out the name of whoever's tweet it is that I'm showing. But in this case, it's pretty well known that Aron makes this argument. It also shows that it is Aron's tweet that I am quoting, and saves any claims that I am somehow using a false tweet. Not that I think that would happen, because, like I say, Aron is pretty well known for this line of argumentation. In the past, Aron has not been quite as explicit as he was in this tweet, which may be part of the reason that his argument was interpreted in a very different way. Something that he has often complained about in the past. In this tweet, we see Aron saying that he isn't claiming that rocks are atheists. He uses the term in a plural way here. But we can take that to mean something like he is not claiming that they are atheist in the sense of a noun. So they are not atheist in the sense that you or I would be considered an atheist. As we can see from the tweet, Aron is clarifying that what he means is that they are atheist in the sense of an adjective. So Aron is using atheist here as a description of one of the qualities or properties that the rock holds. So in the same sense that the rock is hard or smooth or sharp, the rock is atheist. This makes it easier to see why Aron's argument is so easily misunderstood. The term atheist is rarely used in the form of an adjective. It's generally used in the sense of a noun. The adjective used is generally atheistic. Something that was pointed out to Aron in the thread, and something which he then clarified later on. And here is him clarifying it again in a separate conversation with different people. So we can sort of reformulate Aron's argument here to give it a little bit more clarity, and to try to remove some of the linguistic muddle that happens through his choice of terms. Aron's argument then is not that rocks are an atheist. Instead, his argument is that rocks are atheistic. Unfortunately, Aron causes this linguistic muddle often. Aron consistently uses the term atheist instead of atheistic when describing the property that he is referring to. So when this happens, and when necessary, I will do my best to unpack what Aron means. For now though, I think we have enough information where we can somewhat steelman's Aron's position enough to begin moving forward with the discussion about his argument. So from here, we will consider Aron's argument to be rocks are atheistic rather than rocks are atheist. With unpacking Aron's argument and trying to give it the best representation I can out of the way, we should probably look at his reasoning behind the argument next. This should take less work than unpacking exactly what Aron was trying to argue, as the reasoning behind it is incredibly simplistic. In order to understand Aaron's argument properly, it is important to understand the definition of atheism that he is using. When Aaron defines atheism, he is using it in the sense of the absence of theism, as we can see from this tweet. So, under Aaron's definition, anytime we do not see an example of theism, or a belief in God, then what we are seeing is an example of atheism. If something does not believe in God, then it falls under the banner of atheism, and is therefore atheistic or an atheist. As we can see from the tweet, that is his entire reasoning. Something either believes in a god or gods and is therefore theist or theistic, or it does not and is therefore atheist or atheistic. As Aaron says, where there is no theism, there is atheism. So, as both of these tweets show, Aaron's definition is a simple binary definition and a simple binary thought. It essentially boils down to you are either one of them or you're one of us. And this applies to all things that exist in some form or other. The single qualifier for something being atheistic or atheist is that it does not hold the belief a God exists. With both of these ideas unpacked and shown, I think it's safe to say that we have a reasonable steelman of Aaron's position and argument. We can safely summarize Aaron's argument as something like, atheism is simply the absence of theism, and anything that is absent of theism comes under the umbrella of atheism. Everything that comes under the umbrella of atheism is either an atheist or it is atheistic. Rocks fall under the umbrella of atheism, and as they are not an atheist, they must be atheistic. Therefore, rocks are atheistic. Aaron argues that atheism was originally defined as absent of theism, and that this absent of theism is the most prevalent usage today. There are many arguments and questions that could be raised here, of course. Was the term originally used to describe all objects and things that exist in the universe? What about Aaron's claim that it remains the most prevalent usage? How does Aaron know that? What global survey has been done among atheists to discover how they define atheism? Or is it just that most people he encounters use it that way? Is there a selection bias going on? Or is his data skewed because it is based only on those that he encounters? These kind of questions are important, of course, and I look at some of them in my previous video, Atheism, A Tale of Two Usages. There are many questions related to how Aaron defines the term that can and should be brought up, and have been brought up with him many times. A Google and YouTube search will find arguments against the way Aron Ra defines atheism for many people, as well as arguments concerning his misrepresentations and misunderstanding of history. However, this video won't be covering any of that. As stated, I've released a video discussing the definition of atheism. If you're interested in my thoughts on this, they can be found there. Instead, we will simply accept Aaron's definition of atheism here and then work from that. As stated previously, Aaron's argument is that anything that does not fall under the category of theism falls under the category of atheism. This is because Aaron defines theism as believing in a god or gods, and atheism as everything else. Aaron's reasoning is simply, does it believe in God? If yes, then they are theist. If no, then they are atheist. Hence why he gets to rocks are atheist originally, rather than rocks are atheistic. As we could see, he changes that to atheistic later on, showing that there are some extra steps to be gone through. But that is basically how simplistic the thinking is here. Of course, this is only possible because of the way that Aaron defines atheism, and most other definitions don't fall prey to this problem. It is Aaron's definition that is under question here, though, so we will stick to that. The definition of atheist that Aaron uses is a person that lacks belief in God, hence why rocks do not fall under the noun classification of atheist, and instead Aaron classifies it as atheist, adjective. However, since it is an adjective, then it becomes atheistic, hence his conclusion rocks are atheistic. So, now that we've broken down Aaron's argument and shown the claims and reasoning in their strongest form, we can begin the, fun part? Here is where we can actually look at the logical entailments of Aaron's argument and reasoning. What follows is what it means if we say that all things except the belief in God should be considered atheism, or atheistic. The term theist in Aaron's definitions is a person that believes in God, and is mirrored by the definition of atheism as a person that lacks belief in God, or a person that is without theism. So we need not concern ourselves with that definition for this argument. Instead, we will focus solely on things that are incapable of belief in God. If we recall from earlier, that is one of the reasons Aaron classes rocks as atheistic. They are incapable of belief, which means that they can only be atheistic. As an advance warning, please remember to keep your brains cool, as this may get complicated, though I will try to keep it as simple as possible. Let's first take a look at the Bible, or the Quran. Now, let us run the Bible through Aaron's reasoning process. I'll stick to using the Bible to keep the argument a little bit shorter, but you can replace the Bible with the Quran, or the Book of Mormon, or any other holy text you prefer, and the argument will run exactly the same. So let's discover whether or not the Bible is atheistic. Aaron's argument gives us a very simple way of figuring out the answer to that question. We simply need to ask whether or not the Bible believes in God. So, does the Bible believe in God? Well, not according to Aaron's argument. Aaron argues that rocks are unable to believe in anything, which means that they cannot believe in God, so therefore are atheistic. This appears to apply to the Bible as well. The Bible is unable to believe in God. It has no mental or psychological states. If it has no mental or psychological states, then it means that it does not believe in God. It lacks belief in God and is without theism. According to Aaron's reasoning, this means that the Bible can only be atheistic. This would mean that the statement, "the Bible is atheistic," is true. Now, many who argue that the reason they choose to describe rocks as atheistic is simply because it's true. It doesn't matter how ridiculous it sounds, they don't believe in God, so they're atheistic. If this truly is the case, then they must also accept that the statement, "the Bible is atheistic," is true, regardless of how ridiculous it sounds. Yet, most of us would agree that there's something intuitively wrong with calling the Bible atheistic. What about churches or mosques, though? Well, they too would be considered atheistic under this logic. After all, they too do not have the ability to hold beliefs. If, like rocks, they are unable to hold beliefs, then it must follow that, like rocks, they are atheistic. Again, as with the Bible, if the whole reasoning behind calling rocks atheistic is simply because it is true, then it must follow that Aaron, and those that support his argument, should be calling churches or mosques atheistic. Just like calling the Bible atheistic, though, most of us would probably agree that calling churches or mosques atheistic feels intuitively wrong. Hang on to your brains, though, as the next one is the real kicker. Okay, so bear with me with this one. According to Aaron's reasoning, theism itself is atheistic. I can already hear the objections and face-palming from here. After all, how can it be possible that theism is atheistic? It's right there in the name. Theism. Theism is the belief that God exists. So how can it be atheistic? So this one is slightly more complicated than Bibles and churches, but no less true. Aaron considers theism to be the psychological state of believing. If that psychological state exists, then we are seeing theism. So how can the existence of the psychological state of believing in God be the lack of belief? Well, theism is simply the word that we use to describe that psychological state, not the psychological state itself. So, theism is conceptual. It is a term we use to describe a state of affairs, like all words are. They are not the state of affairs themselves. So, when we see the word theism, we are not seeing the actual belief itself. The question then becomes, does the word theism believe in God in and of itself? And of course, the answer here is that no, it does not. Like a rock, the concept itself is incapable of belief, and therefore, like a rock, it does not believe in God. This means that theism itself can only be atheistic, according to Aaron's reasoning. Yet, like with Bibles and churches, there seems to be a bit of a linguistic muddle going on when we say something like theism is atheistic. There also seems to be a conceptual muddle happening when we say theism is atheistic too. And we could also argue something of a logical muddle as well. To say that anything related to theism beyond the existence of the psychological state of believing in God itself is atheistic feels intuitively, linguistically, and logically wrong. After all, we generally considered anything that is related to or promotes forms of theism, like Christianity or Islam, or even just belief in God in general, to be theistic, regardless of whether the object itself believes in God or not. If it is related to the promotion of belief in God, or related to belief in God, then it simply is theistic. Aaron may or may not agree here, and his supporters may or may not agree here. I will go out on a limb, though, and say they probably would agree with this statement. That's the most charitable interpretation possible, so that's the interpretation I would take. If we instead say that anything that is related to the promotion of belief in God, or is in some way connected with the idea of belief in God, is theistic, then the problems just mentioned are dissolved, right? Well, no, not exactly. The first problem here is that there is then an asymmetry between what it means for something to be atheistic and something to be theistic. On one side, the theistic side, we define it as a necessary relationship with the idea itself and the promotion of the idea itself, and not based on whether or not what is being discussed believes in God. On the atheistic side, it is not concerned with whether or not the term is connected with the promotion of atheism, only with whether or not whatever is being discussed does not believe in God. In this sense, atheistic and theistic are not defined in relation to each other, or in relation to the concept being promoted. It is a case of one rule for one, and an entirely different rule for the other. The second problem is that defining theistic in terms of describing things that are connected to theism, and atheistic only in terms of something like not believing God exists, then we're still left with the linguistic muddle. In fact, it makes the linguistic muddle even worse. Defining theistic and atheistic with this asymmetry means that the Bible, the Quran, churches, mosques, and theism itself remain atheistic. But it also means that they are theistic. So the Bible becomes both atheistic and theistic at the same time, as do churches. So it is just as true to say that a church is atheistic as it is to say that a church is theistic. Yet, only one of those statements actually feels true. Of course, it could simply be that we have to accept that some things are just both atheistic and theistic. We could just be allowing language to create a kind of muddle in our minds, and we should only be concerned with the fact that both statements are true. However, if we untangle this linguistic muddle, we're still left with something of a logical muddle. Let's look at the simplistic dichotomy that Aaron uses, that theism and atheism are a true dichotomy. Theism is the belief that God exists, and wherever that is absent, then we are seeing atheism. Atheism is anything without theism. This dichotomy would also imply that something cannot be both atheistic and theistic at the same time. So that would mean that this dichotomy is false. Or Bibles and churches cannot be both atheistic and theistic at the same time. Or it could simply be that the definitions and reasoning that Aaron and the supporters of his argument are just making a terrible argument. Something cannot both contain and be absent of theism at the same time. I can hear Aaron and his supporters cry out, "Aha, gotcha," here. There is the problem. And the solution. The Bible and a church cannot be absent of theism, because they are about the promotion of theism, and theism is contained within it. Therefore, this dichotomy holds true. These things are not absent of theism, so therefore they are not theistic and atheistic at the same time. They do not exist in both camps simultaneously, so no logical muddle. There is only me being illogical and making a bad argument. Unfortunately, this counter-argument to my claims is shown to be faulty by Aaron's argument itself. Let's call back to his argument that a rock is incapable of believing anything, and therefore does not believe in God. It is absent of theism, and therefore atheistic. The same is true for a church and a Bible. Neither of these things are capable of belief. which means they cannot hold beliefs and therefore do not believe in God. A church is capable of holding believers and promoting the idea of theism, meaning that it contains theism within it, but the church itself is absent of theism in that it does not, in and of itself, believe in God. And the same goes for anything that is theistic in nature beyond a person that believes God exists. So, to some extent, a church, a Bible, a Quran, a mosque, a temple, and the concept of theism itself both contain theism and are absent of theism in the way that Aaron describes, which, according to Aaron's dichotomy, is impossible. Something either has theism or is without theism. Something either believes in God or it does not believe in God. Something is either theistic or atheistic. If something is one and not the other, Aaron's argument, definitions, and reasoning creates what we could now label Ra's atheistic paradox. If Aaron's argument, definitions, and reasoning lead to this linguistic and logical muddle and cause Ra's atheistic paradox, why then does he continue to argue for it? And why do atheists that support him continue to make this argument, even though other atheists are calling it dumb and ridiculous? There are those that argue that the reason they make the rocks are atheist or the rocks are atheistic argument is because it's true. That's all that really matters about this argument. It is making a true claim. For those that make this argument, I shall wait to see whether they are so eager to cling on to that claim when it comes to arguing that churches and the Bible are atheistic or atheist. For now, though, I will say no more about those making this claim that they make the argument because it is true. For Aaron, the reason why he makes this argument is something substantially different. As we can see from Aaron's tweet, his argument is not concerned with logic, or reason, or truth. His argument is concerned with making an ideological point. That we do not need to have heard and conceptualized the claims of theism to not believe in them. Of course, arguing that a rock does not believe something certainly does show the idea that there are things that exist that have never heard a claim but do not believe it. It's almost certainly not a very good argument to support that idea, though. We generally do not speak of inanimate objects in terms of what they believe and do not believe, because there's no meaningful conversation to be had there. We generally limit discussions about beliefs to those things that can actually hold beliefs to begin with. It is right to say that I do not believe in God, because it is also possible for me to believe in God. We can say that I lack the belief that God exists, because it is possible for me to hold the belief that God exists. Well, it might be true to say that a rock or a Bible or a church lacks a belief in God. It is only trivially true. There is nothing of meaning to be had from making those statements and arguments, at least not beyond any ideological stance. Of course, I can understand wanting to push the idea that you do not have to have heard something in order to not believe it. Especially if the category of atheism that you're pushing is that of the does not believe in God category. The big question here, though, is why this argument? As can be seen, the argument itself is terrible. It leads to logical problems and linguistic problems, and it's actually a self-defeating argument. It also obviously does not make the point that Aaron claims he is trying to make, because most people do not take that point from it. Aaron also claims that his argument is often misrepresented, and that people are misunderstanding it. Yet, he continues to cling to it and to promote it. Even when other atheists call it a terrible argument, and other atheists continue to tell him to stop with the argument, he carries on making it. He is told that it makes atheists look ridiculous, and this kind of argumentation does make atheists look ridiculous. Yet, still, he continues to make it. There are much better arguments to be made to make this kind of point. Arguments that do not involve reducing atheists to arguing for the absurd idea that rocks and churches and mosques and Bibles and Qurans are atheistic or atheist or belong in the category of atheism. One does not need to argue that rocks do not believe in God So there we have evidence that you do not need to hear something to not believe something, or that one does not need to have cognitive capabilities in order to not believe something. So why does Aaron and those that support his argument continue to cling on to this ridiculous argument and continue to make this ridiculous argument? Surely it's time to drop this argument and move on to better arguments that attempt to make the case. One of the problems comes from the ideological drive to push for the atheism as a lack of belief definition. There has been a constant push from many to collapse all of non-theism into atheism, and to turn atheism into simply not having a particular mental state, rather than as a stance on the question of whether or not God exists. Hence the reason that Aaron's argument is attempting to push that someone or something does not need to have heard the idea to not believe in it. You do not need to have heard the question to not have the psychological state of non-belief. By default, you have the psychological state of non-belief. In fact, you do not even need psychological states to not hold the belief that something is true, which is one of the problems with the lack of belief definition, because it is not defined as the psychological state of non-belief. It is simply defined as a lack of belief in gods, which is what leads to the reductio ad absurdum of rocks and churches and the Bible and the Quran and mosques and theism being atheist and atheistic. Now, one could argue here that defining it simply as non-belief would lead to the same thing. But defining it as the psychological state of non-belief in gods does not. It may lead to some other less than meaningful statements like animals are atheists, but at least it removes the idea that a rock or a church or a Bible is atheist or atheistic. As we saw in Aaron's tweet, another part of his reasoning behind this ridiculous rock argument is that he wants to argue for and show that atheism is the default position. That we need to have heard an argument to believe it, but we don't need to have heard the argument to not believe it. Of course, there are arguments that can be made here to counter this idea, but we will simply accept Aaron's claim and say that this is true. We do not need to reduce it down to inanimate objects with no cognitive capacities to show that this is true, though. It would still be possible to argue that atheism is the default position if atheism was defined as the psychological state of non-belief in God. Aaron's argument should be put to bed. It should be ejected from the thoughts of atheists that support it. To put it in terms that Aaron might, atheists should lack a belief in the idea that rocks are atheist or atheistic, and lack a belief that the rocks are atheist or atheistic argument makes any meaningful point. There's so much more that can be said here. So much more. There are contradictions in claims that atheists make, like atheism is a reasoned position that comes from critical thinking, as if rocks can be considered to fall under the umbrella of atheism, and all it takes is to lack a belief, then it cannot be the case that atheism is a reasoned position. If atheism is the default position, one that is not arrived at through thought, but exists simply because a particular configuration of neurons does not exist, then that also means that it cannot be a reasoned position. There are discussions to be had about how belief should only be considered in connection with things that are capable of having mental and psychological states. There are problems describing atheism simply as a lack of belief in gods. However, there are many others out there that cover these arguments, and in a much more eloquent way with stronger arguments than I could ever make. For now, though, I think it's safe to say that the argument made here shows why this argument is terrible, and it shows why Aaron and those that support him in this argument should stop making it. At least if they actually do care about truth, logic, reason, rationality, or critical thinking. Of course, for those that don't care about any of these things, knock yourselves out. For those that do care about these things, the next time we're confronted with Aaron making this stupid and ridiculous argument, or any of his supporters that are making this stupid and ridiculous argument, I suggest we remind them that we are not going to fall for Ra's atheistic paradox. For those that wish to continue using the rocks are atheistic argument, and let's face it, there's little doubt that Aaron and those that support him will continue to use it. I have a suggestion. If all you care about is the fact that the conclusion is true, and you don't care how ridiculous the argument sounds, then from now on, start replacing rocks with churches, or mosques, or the Bible, or the Quran, or the Book of Mormon. What is true of rocks is equally true of those things. For the rest of us, I suggest that our response to Aaron's argument, and to Aaron, whenever it shows up, is this.
You get out of here, you hear me? Never look back! You are dead to us!